Right. So today we will discuss a practical approach to hyponatremia. So definition. Hyponatremia is defined as serum sodium less than 135 milliequivalents per liter. The normal range is 135 to 145. The important thing which I want to point out here is that electrolytes are very strictly maintained in the normal range by the body, and even the slightest of decrease in the serum sodium cannot be brushed off as a normal variant. So even if we encounter a sodium which is 134, or even if it is 135, that should immediately point towards a pathology which is ongoing and which is lowering the serum sodium. So quite often it so happens that a value of the 135 or 134 is brushed aside, and the etiology behind it is not investigated, and then the patient will later on present with more severe variants or maybe even symptomatic variants of hyponatremia. So electrolytes are not like blood glucose. You cannot say that, okay, if it is 110 or it is 109, it is the same. 134 and 135 is a big deal. There is also something called pseudo hyponatremia, which is actually very rare. It is basically an error in the estimation of sodium when the lipid levels or the protein levels are very high. But those occur in very, very rare conditions. So for the practical approach, we can ignore pseudo hyponatremia. So pathophysiology of hyponatremia is actually quite complicated because there are several factors which are in play, and different authors have tried to use different ways to explain it. But I will present a very simplified pathophysiology. So basically there are two factors. Factor number one is water excess, which is in large found out here because it is the dominant factor. And the second factor, which may be there in some conditions, that is a reduced sodium intake. Now, when I say water excess, it means water excess, both absolute excess as well as relative excess. Relative excess would be, for example, if you are losing both sodium and water, but you are losing more sodium and less water, then that is also a relative water excess. An absolute water excess will be when you don't lose sodium and you still continue to gain water. So basically, water excess is the main pathophysiologic factor. And what mediates the water excess? It is the AVP hormone, which mediates the water excess. So based upon the cause of AVP excess, we have the classification of hyponatremia, which most of us are familiar. That is hypovolemic hyponatremia, hypervolemic, and euvolemic. So hypovolemic hyponatremia is when the cause of AVP excess is stimulation by volume depletion. Hypervolemic is when stimulation of AVP excess is by intravascular volume depletion. In hypovolemic, there is overall volume depletion. In hypervolemic, there is intravascular volume depletion. And in euvolemic, there is no volume depletion. There is just inappropriate secretion of AVP. So this slide is from the previous discussion, which we had on diabetes insipidus. There are two systems which regulate AVP. One is the osmotic system, and the other is the pressure volume system. In fact, earlier it was thought that there are two different hormones. There is something called antidiuretic hormone, which responds to changes in osmotic values on the blood, that is osmolality. And you have a vasopressin, which responds to change in blood pressure on blood volume. I showed you this graph earlier also. So vasopressin is very sensitive to small changes in osmolality. Even 1% change in osmolality causes a big increase in the secretion of vasopressin, as you can see in this particular line. But if you look at volume or pressure, they respond much later. Around 10% or more of volume or pressure is supposed to go down before vasopressin responds. But the response of vasopressin can be much more robust than it responds to osmolality if the pressure and volumes go down. So this is how a decrease in volume causes a stimulation of vasopressin. And just to recap, what does vasopressin do or AVP do? AVP acts upon the cells in the distal tubule of the kidney, and it causes increase in this aquaporin 2 transporter, which absorbs water, only water from the lumen of the distal tubule, and this water again comes into the cell and finally into the body. And therefore, if you have too much of AVP, you will absorb a lot of water, and this water will dilute your blood and lead to a low concentration of sodium. So this is a simplified description of how AVP will cause, excess AVP will cause hyponatremia. So now a brief discussion about individual classes. First of all, hypovolemic hyponatremia. Now, hypovolemic hyponatremia does not mean that your patient has to be dehydrated, because a lot of patients will have received some form of rehydration, which would most likely have been some hypotonic replacement fluid. The typical examples of hypovolemic hyponatremia are thiazide diuretics, that is a renal loss of sodium. Other common causes, diarrhea or vomiting. And then less common causes include primary adrenal insufficiency, and to be more specific, aldosterone deficiency. Then salt losing nephropathies and cerebral salt wasting. These are the other less common causes of hypovolemic hyponatremia. So what I was trying to say is, you could be having a lot of diarrhea and you're losing both salt and water, but you felt thirsty when you drank a lot of plain water. So therefore you ended up with, not with obvious dehydration, but with a hypotonic rehydration, and therefore you have hypovolemic hyponatremia, but still you are not in obvious hypovolemia. But the cause of hyponatremia was the hypovolemia. That hypovolemia stimulated the ADH, the AVP secretion, and that AVP caused you to absorb whatever water you were drinking back into the blood. So this diagram shows how sodium moves through the kidney. Sodium is filtered at the glomerulus. Then in the proximal tubule, around 70% is absorbed, as you can see out here. Then you have the loop of Henle, and in the thick ascending limb, you have this sodium potassium 2-chloride transporter, which absorbs sodium, and this is the site of action of loop diuretics. It is important that this is important because whatever sodium and potassium it reabsorbs, this contributes to the osmotic gradient in the medulla. So the medullary concentration depends upon how much sodium you can take into the medulla from here. Then subsequently, you have in the distal tubule the sodium chloride cotransporter. This is where the thiazides act. And then later on, you have the sodium and H+ symporter, which is acted upon by aldosterone. And then down here, you have the distal collecting duct portion where the AVP or the ADH acts upon the aquaporin 2 receptors to absorb water. Now, this absorption of water depends upon the medullary concentration, which is driven by the loop diuretics. So what happens with thiazides is, thiazide will block the sodium reabsorption through this at this place, because of which you will have extra sodium in the lumen of the distal tubule, and which will be excreted. So in the beginning, you will start losing sodium, and because you are losing sodium, you're also losing water with it. When this loss becomes enough to cause hypovolemia, then ADH will increase, and once ADH will increase, ADH will reabsorb water, but the sodium loss will continue. So what you will end up with is hyponatremia, which stimulated ADH, hypovolemia, which stimulated ADH, subsequently which led to increased water reabsorption, causing a hypovolemic hyponatremia. Importantly, loop diuretics generally do not cause hyponatremia, because although they impair sodium reabsorption, they also reduce the concentration out here. So if the concentration out here is low, the reabsorption of water is not that proper. So you reabsorb less water, and sort of balances out the sodium excretion with the decrement in the water absorption. So that is why hyponatremia is more likely to occur with thiazides rather than with loop diuretics. And similarly, in primary adrenal insufficiency, as I said, aldosterone deficiency will occur. Again, the same thing will happen. Sodium reabsorption out here is impaired, and then you begin with initially with sodium loss, then later on increase in ADH, increase the absorption of water. So this is how both thiazides and aldosterone deficiency will work. Hypervolemic hyponatremia is relatively easier to understand. These are edematous states in which interstitial volume is increased, but the actual blood volume or circulating volume is reduced. So because of either increase in the pressure or a decrease in the oncotic pressure within the capillaries, that is either because of CHF or because of decrease in proteins as in cirrhosis or nephrotic syndrome, you will have peripheral edema, but the blood volume will go down. The reduced blood volume will stimulate AVP. AVP will reabsorb more fluid from the distal tubule, and you will have more water, and gradually you will have a dilution of the sodium in the blood, and you will end up with hypervolemic hyponatremia. Apart from these three, CKD is another important cause of hypervolemic hyponatremia. Now we come to eovolemic hyponatremia. So simply speaking, eovolemic hyponatremia, there is inappropriate secretion of AVP. Hypothyroidism is one cause. Hypothyroidism is known to increase the AVP secretion. Similarly, cortisol, normal cortisol levels tend to suppress AVP secretion. And when you have cortisol deficiency, you have increase in AVP secretion. Again, I want to remind you, when it is pure cortisol deficiency, you will have euvolemic hyponatremia. But when you will have both cortisol as well as aldosterone deficiency, you will have hypovolemic hyponatremia. So if you have a disease which is destroying the adrenals, such as adrenal tuberculosis or histoplasmosis or adrenalectomy, you will end up with euvolemic hyponatremia, hypovolemic hyponatremia. But if you have something like a pituitary disease or exogenous Cushing syndrome, then you will only suppress cortisol secretion, and then you will end up with euvolemic hyponatremia. And then the third is syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion. Actually, one can argue that both hypothyroidism and cortisol deficiency are also inappropriate secretion of AVP, so they are also part of SIADH. But traditionally, these two have been considered as separate disorders. And in fact, you should exclude these two before you can label anybody that this is SIADH. So the pathogenesis is same, but the nomenclature is different. There are several criteria which have been described to define SIADH, but these include hyponatremia. That should be hypoosmolar hyponatremia. I will just discuss that in a while. Why not hyperosmolar? Why hypoosmolar? So hypoosmolar hyponatremia, that is serum osmolality should be low. Hyponatremia along with euvolemia and urine osmolality more than 100. Urine osmolality is more because if there is excess ADH, then urine will be concentrated. You will absorb the water from the urine, so urine concentration will become high. So it should be always be more than 100. If it is less than 100, then that means ADH excess is not there. Then causes of SIADH. SIADH is a huge list. Important ones, most importantly, are drugs. Desmopressin and vasopressin, of course, will cause SIADH because that is the hormone that is at play out here. But apart from that, but these are not commonly used drugs. The common ones are SSRIs, antipsychotics, antiepileptics, and MDMA again is a drug of abuse. Apart from this, CNS infections such as meningitis or CNS abscesses, bleeds, CVA, subdural hemorrhages, these can all present with SIADH. Pulmonary causes are important, pneumonia, TB, etc. Even COVID has been known to cause SIADH. So those on COVID duty should be vigilant about hyponatremia in those patients. Then and a lot of neoplasms as mentioned in the list. So there is a huge list. Even this is a not exhaustive list. There is a huge list of causes of SIADH, which can all stimulate secretion of AVP in the absence of any increase in osmolality or decrease in blood volume. So coming to clinical features. Coming to clinical features, we have acute hyponatremia, which is less than 48 hours duration, and chronic, which is more than 48 hours duration. So if the sodium is more than 125, generally no symptoms occur. So this window between 135 to 125 is the period in which there is no symptoms. And this is actually a dangerous period because patient does not have symptoms, and unless somebody closely investigates, you will miss this period and you will straight away land up with a more severe hyponatremia. Then between 120 to 125, subtle symptoms emerge. These include nausea, vomiting, and headache. But the typical neurological symptoms generally are seen when the sodium falls below 120 milliequivalent per liter. And these include altered behavior, seizure, cerebral herniation, coma, and death. So what happens is basically the osmotic flow of fluid begins from the blood to the brain. So the concentration inside the cells is higher. Sodium levels have gone down. So the gradient is from movement of fluid from the blood into the brain cells. And this causes cerebral edema. And this leads to the manifestations and can even cause herniation. And that can lead to death. If you talk about chronic hyponatremia, there occurs an adaptation to this hyponatremia, and this adaptation occurs in the form of cells removing or extruding these other osmoles from within themselves. So cells will lose amino acids, proteins, etc., so that their osmolality begins to approach that of the serum osmolality, so as to prevent the flow of fluid from the blood into the brain. So symptoms will be a bit subtle, and they may occur at lower values. So you may have neurological symptoms occurring at much lower value, maybe less than 110. But even asymptomatic patients will have gait abnormalities. They have frequent falls, and hyponatremia can also increase osteoporosis according to some data, and therefore increase the risk of fractures. This has been documented. So even a borderline low sodium should not be ignored or left alone, because they may not be obvious symptoms, but actually it may lead to later on a fracture. So how to diagnose hyponatremia? First is to suspect hyponatremia, especially in patients who are elderly and who present with altered behavior, etc., or maybe even recurrent falls. Then we should measure sodium. It is important to rule out hyperosmotic hyponatremia, which is basically either diabetes or mannitol use. So what happens in diabetes? Serum sodium falls by 2 millicurie per liter for every 100 milligram per dl increase in the blood glucose levels. So therefore, you have to calculate the corrected sodium if you have uncontrolled hyperglycemia. So let's say if the sodium value is 136 and the blood glucose is 300. So the corrected sodium will be 2 millicoulombs for every 100. So you have here 200 is more, so 4 millicoulombs. 4 millicoulombs will have to added to the sodium level to get the corrected sodium. Similarly, mannitol use can also lead to hyperosmotic hyponatremia. So here there is a increased because of osmotic diuresis, there is increased loss of both sodium and the fluid in the urine. Then next step is to assess the volume status, especially postural tachycardia and hypotension. So patients may not be obviously in hypotension or in obvious dehydration, but if they have tachycardia on standing up or blood pressure falls on standing up, then that is a marker of reduced volume. Edema can be picked up relatively easily, and that indicates hypervolemic state. So based upon this assessment, we have to decide whether it is hypovolemic, euvolemic, or hypervolemic. Next step is to review the history for the common causes of each. If you think it is euvolemic, then you just go back and look at the history of the patient and see what causes of euvolemic hyponatremia are operational in the patient, and you find a cause which is operational, then you have got your answer. It's important to look at history of drugs. Thiazide diuretics are a very notorious cause of hyponatremia. In my experience, it is the most common cause. Apart from that, SSRIs commonly used. Amitriptyline is not only used for depression, but also used for neuropathic pain, diabetic neuropathy also. Carbamazepine also quite commonly used drug, not only as an anticonvulsant, but also for other indications. Then does the patient have any disease which causes SIADH? There's a huge list, and an hospitalized patient may be having one of those diseases also. And it is important also to ask the patient how much water they drink. They may be having psychogenic polydipsia, or patient may be drinking large amounts of alcohol and not eating much, which is a beer potomania. So if we talk about investigations which have to be done in the workup of hyponatremia, most texts will mention these three investigations: serum osmolality, urine osmolality, and urine sodium. So what is the purpose of doing serum osmolality? Most cases of hyponatremia, serum osmolality should be low because sodium is the important contributor to the osmolality. But if you have diabetes or you're having other, you're adding other hypertonic solutions to the blood, such as mannitol, you will have high serum osmolality accompanied by hyponatremia. So that is what you look at by looking at serum osmolality. Urine osmolality is to be checked if you are suspecting euvolemic hyponatremia. If the osmolality is high, then likely it is SIADH. But if it is low, that means the patient may be drinking large amounts of water or maybe psychogenic polydipsia. Urine sodium is performed if you are handling either hypo or hypervolemic hyponatremia and you're not sure whether it is a renal loss or a non-renal loss. If it is urine sodium is low, then that means it's a non-renal loss. If the renal sodium, urine sodium is high, that means it is a renal salt loss. But as you would have guessed, most of these interpretations can actually be done by history and examination alone. For example, you can check the blood glucose to rule out diabetes. You already know whether the patient is getting mannitol. You can ask the patient about psychogenic polydipsia, or you can admit the patient and see how much water they're drinking. So similarly, you can take a history and find out whether the patient has renal disease, or they have been vomiting, or they have been having diarrhea, etc. So for most conditions, these investigations are not mandated to make a diagnosis. Just by taking a good history and correlating it with the history, diagnosis can be made and treatment can be started. But there can be some rare conditions in which you may feel stuck, and you can then order these investigations. Serum osmolality and urine osmolality are now available in DEM, and urine sodium also we can do. It's just the same machine. You have to put urine instead of the serum. So that we don't do usually, but if need be, if you ask for it, we can arrange for that also. So now we move to the treatment. So the first question you want to ask in terms of treatment is the patient symptomatic? And symptomatic, I mean neurological symptoms. If the patient is symptomatic, then serum sodium most likely will be less than 120. And the treatment for this is hypertonic saline, which we use is 3% saline. If the patient is asymptomatic, then we do not give 3% saline. This is important to know. You should not give 3% saline if the patient is not symptomatic. We'll first discuss the treatment of the symptomatic patient and then talk about the asymptomatic patients. So treatment of symptomatic patient is same for all three, whether it is euvolemic, hypervolemic, hypovolemic, there is no difference. You have to use the same protocol. You have to administer 3% saline, but it has to be administered carefully. The target is to raise the serum sodium by 1 to 2 milliequivalent per liter per hour for 3 to 4 hours. That is an increment of around 3 to 6 milliequivalent per liter in the sodium level will be enough to alleviate the symptoms. It is important that we should not raise more than 12 milliequivalent per liter sodium in a 24-hour period. And also it is important that we should not achieve a value more than 120. So if the patient is having 116 value and is symptomatic, you don't want to cross 120 on the treatment part. You already know why this should not be done. It cannot be done because of the risk of osmotic demyelination syndrome or ODS. So ODS occurs because of rapid or overcorrection of hyponatremia. The cause is osmotic shift leading to edema and neuronal damage. Then flaccid paralysis, dysarthria, and dysphagia are the manifestations of ODS. And the risk factors include more than 12 milliequivalent rise in the serum sodium in 24 hours, as we discussed, hypokalemia, malnutrition, and alcoholisms. So if the patient has any of these factors, then you should be doubly cautious. So how to calculate the dose of hypertonic saline and how to give the correction? So different textbooks have mentioned different protocols, but this particular protocol is the one which I feel is quite rational, and it will prevent us from making mistakes. And this is from the Washington manual. So the formula says the change in sodium, that is delta sodium, from giving 1 liter of a fluid infusion is equal to sodium in the infused fluid plus potassium in the infused fluid minus serum sodium divided by total body weight, total body water plus 1. So total body water is body weight into 0.5 in females and 0.6 in males. So example, 65 kg man with serum sodium 110 milliequivalent per liter and you want to give him 3% saline. 3% saline has 513 milliequivalent per liter of sodium. So just delta sodium from 1 liter of 3% saline in this patient is equal to 513, that is the sodium in the infused fluid, plus 0, that is the potassium in the infused fluid is 0, minus 110, which is the serum sodium of the patient, divided by 65, that is the weight of the patient, multiplied by 0.6, which is the factor for males for total body water, plus 1. And if you calculate, it will come out to be close to 10. So this means 1 liter of 3% saline in this patient will increase the serum sodium by 10 milliequivalent per liter. So that means if 1 liter is increasing by 10, then 100 ml will increase by 1 milliequivalent per liter. So if we want to increase the sodium of this patient by 1 milliequivalent per liter per hour, then we will infuse 100 ml of 3% saline per hour for the next 3 to 4 hours. And generally this will be enough to relieve the symptoms. But if the symptoms are severe and you suspect that cerebral herniation may be about to occur, then you can go for a higher dose, that is 200 milliliter per hour or 2 milliequivalent per liter per hour for 3 to 4 hours. But in this case, again, you will not exceed 1 liter in 24 hours because 1 liter is around 10 milliequivalent and 12 milliequivalent is the limit. So you don't want to go beyond that limit. So this is how you will manage the acute symptomatic hyponatremia. The moment the symptoms have resolved, then you stop 3% saline and you again then pick up the specific therapy for the type of hyponatremia that you are dealing with. So now we are coming to the specific therapies. Hypovolemic hyponatremia, the treatment is volume expansion, typically with normal saline or 0.9% saline, which is 154 milliequivalent per liter of sodium. And if you want, you can actually use the same formula that we discussed earlier for calculating how much saline you want to give to the patient. You must be careful if the patient has CHF or renal dysfunction, because large volume of saline can lead to fluid overload. And in those conditions, you might want to give diuretics additionally along with that. Once the fluid overload occurs, not in the beginning, of course. Hypervolemic hyponatremia treatment includes number 1, fluid restriction. So if the patient is taking a large amount of liquids orally, then that will obviously worsen and that may actually be the cause of hyponatremia. Then you can use loop diuretics, which will excrete both sodium and water, but they will excrete much more water than sodium, and you will have relief of the hyponatremia. And then there are vaptans, which are the AVP antagonists, which can also be used. Euvolemic hyponatremia is the other common presentation that we will have. So when you are faced with euvolemic hyponatremia, step 1 is to check and correct thyroid and adrenal dysfunction. So if these are there, then just simply correction of these may be enough to make the sodium levels come back to normal. Then you have to look at the cause and treat it if possible. For example, drugs is a common cause of SIADH. So if you can withdraw the drug, there may be a rapid recovery in the serum sodium levels. Similarly, if you have some infection, etc., you have to continue to treat the infection. Then fluid restriction is the mainstay of treatment. You should allow only 0.5 to 1 liter of fluid per day. And this includes water, tea, coffee, juice, etc., everything. Some amount of fluid also comes from the food that we eat. The seemingly solid looking food also has some amount of fluid, and that fluid will take care of the insensible losses. Another guide to the fluid restriction is that fluid intake should be at least 0.5 liter less than the urine output. So if the urine output is 1.5 liters, then fluid intake should be kept at 1 liter or less. If it is only 1 liter, then you keep it at 0.5. Then tolvaptan, which is again from the vaptan group, AVP antagonists. These have been used especially in malignancy related SIADH. The dose is 15 to 60 milligrams OD. This is oral preparation, but you have to monitor the sodium carefully here also, because there can be a rapid rise in sodium in some patients and they can again have ODS and other things. So even giving this on OPD basis should be avoided. You should preferably keep the patient in hospital and monitor the sodium once you're treating with vaptans. Salt administration is something which a lot of people do, and it sounds intuitive also. Sodium is low, so give more sodium. That should fix the problem. But salt administration is unphysiological because except those cases in which, rare cases in which salt intake is decreased, majority of cases, as we discussed, are because of water excess. So the problem is not decreased salt intake, it is water excess. So this is not a good idea to give them more salt. There is no data or treatment protocol of how to use salt in SIADH or other forms of hyponatremia. There are difficulties in giving the sodium also. People try to empty out capsules and fill it with salt and then give, but still it's a cumbersome process. And then salt absorption will cause a sudden spike in the osmolality, which may aggravate thirst, and that thirst will lead to drinking more water, which may offset the benefit. So because of these reasons, salt administration is not supported by literature as a treatment modality for any form of hyponatremia. So with that, this is the practical approach, and I will now stop this session, and